Chapter 5: Utilitarianism's Bad Breath. A Reevaluation of the Public Interest Justification for Planning. This chapter is about how the legitimization of planning as an activity which intervenes in land and property markets has long rested on the notion that some restrictions of individual property rights are necessary if the public interest is to be upheld. Basically, this chapter discusses the different schools of thought surrounding public interest in planning in early British and American history. Public interest in planning. There are many debates between scholars about the value of public interest as a legitimizing concept because it cannot be given meaning either by those who make policy or by those who evaluate policy. An argument in this chapter backing up this debate is that the public interest is actually just a smokescreen or facade which prohibits any real evaluation of what effects the planning system actually has in practice. A modern-day example of this can be seen with the debate over eminent domain. A local example of public interest in planning when it comes to eminent domain is the controversy surrounding the construction of the new Cowboys Stadium in Arlington. This example shows how hard it is to gauge winners and losers of planning in regards to the greater public interest. The controversy of public interest. In the most limited sense, the public interest is used to express approval, approbation, or commendation of public policy. Because of this broad definition, people argue that it is all that the public interest represents, which renders it useless as a standard which to judge public actions. A real-life example would be how city councils and town hall meetings can generate heated arguments based on public interest. The chapter says that governments are expected to justify their actions. They are supposed to define what is good, and that leads to decisions and policies that a government may impose on its citizens, which many times may be controversial. Public interest functions justify actions in situations in which there is a disagreement. It relates to the problem of one and the many. In simpler terms, using the term public interest is a way to defend an action that may alienate a certain person or smaller group in order to serve or plan for the greater good of the whole or majority of the community. Understanding public interest. A quote from this chapter that sets up the study of public interest is, "In the spirit that we explore the problems of the concept of public interest in relation of contemporary reflections on the role and purpose of planning." Again, this goes back to the idea that planning is necessary in order to satisfy public interest. The two types of interest. There are two different types of interest. There is the interest in something and the interest in which you have something at stake. The interest in something relates to a concern with or attention to something. The book's example is having an interest in historic buildings or something like 20th century music. The concept of interest is entirely subjective. The interest in which you have something at stake is particularly relevant in consideration of public interest and is associated with welfare, gain, or advantage. In utilitarian terms, this type of interest is associated with happiness or utility. This type of interest is primarily what Chapter 5 is concerned with. Interests in politics. Individual interests have always been recognized as important in politics, but it was not until the Enlightenment period that the idea of satisfying individual subjective interests came to be an important objective of political action. The idea of interest in the realm of politics has been seen in a variety of different ways. The first three main ideas were seen as: 1. Edmund Burke's concept of virtual representation. 2. The Madisonian conceptions of liberalism in the United States. And 3. The utilitarian tradition as developed in Britain. From these three concepts of interest in politics, multiple new viewpoints of how interest should be handled in politics have developed. A modern example of interest-driven political movements can be seen in the 99% demonstrations on Wall Street and throughout the United States. Political interests have and probably always will be a hot-button issue that can foster strong opinions from groups of individuals. Edmund Burke's virtual representation. For Burke, members of Parliament represented interests and not people. He believed that the people might be mistaken about their interests, and because of this, the Parliament was under no obligation to follow the wishes of their constituents. Interests for Burke were broad and objective, and not specific and particularistic. The The Madisonian conception of liberalism. For Madison, interests were always plural, attached, and subjective. He believed that the individual can know what his or her interests are. Madison believed that an elected representative was mandated to follow his constituents' wishes. This process would provide checks and balances to ensure that no minority's interests would be tyrannized. Utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was premised on the assumption that only the individual can know his or her interests, and that the only consistent test of the consequences of an action is the pleasure or pain that is experienced by the person or persons affected. In the realm of public choice, a good policy is one in which aggregate terms maximizes individual pleasure or utility. This belief led to the idea of smaller government and ultimately a push for social reform in the 19th century for Great Britain. Utilitarianism in government. Chapter 5 quotes Bentham, who recognized that each individual has a social or other regarding interest, as well as a self-regarding interest. He found that the majority of individuals prefer to pursue their private interests rather than the public interests. He argued that the task of the government, if need be, through wise legislation, was to persuade or coerce its citizens to act in the interests of the common good. Early British versus American ideas for public interest. In Britain, the public interest was a unitary concept based not upon the adding together of subjective preferences or electors, but representing the sum of the objective interests that comprise the nation when these interests are correctly determined through rational deliberation. Conversely, America was anticipating the idea of a plural society in which the government would balance and adjust sectional interests rather than responding directly to a majoritarian preference. This is why representatives represent districts based on population in America. The public interest in planning. An effective land use planning system was created in Britain in the 1940s, and it struck at the heart of the private interest in the land and property. Planning was conceived as the means by which the best use of land could be secured, irrespective of market conditions, and this required unreserved acceptance of the need to subordinate private interests to the public interest. Change in thinking. The post-war years in America were characterized by a strong belief on the part of the emerging profession that public interest stood at the heart of the professional concerns. This influence came in part from the progressive movement. These professionals helped with research of public interest, which in turn helped shape policies to help certain interest groups. Early on, public interest was deeply criticized because it could not be scientifically measured. This basically means professions and ideas were shaped and created in order to satisfy the interests of the society. Because of the diversity of societies, special interest groups competing for attention and resources imply new strategies and modified conceptions of professional responsibility. This idea is what seems to have been behind the creation of today's special interest groups or lobbyists. Public interest conceptualization categories. Public interest can be divided into two basic categories, subjective and objective. Subjective categories involve variants of utilitarianism and are individualistic in the sense that they assume that judgments in the end are dependent on individual evaluations of good or bad, or better or worse. Objective categories emphasize collective values either in the sense of interest generally shared by everyone, or in terms of a normative standard against which judgments are made concerning collective interests or the common goal. Utilitarianism revisited. Because utilitarianism is such an important theme of this chapter, I wanted to briefly revisit it here. In theory, the individual stands at the center of utilitarianism. It is the sentient human being who experiences pain or pleasure. However, in practice, the utilitarian principle recognizes the conflict between public and private interests, and that the state has a necessary role in ensuring that the individual's pursuit of private pleasure is consonant with the collective good as represented by general welfare. Unitary public interest. In unitary public interest, the individual interests are seen to be an important part of determining the public interest, but it also gives emphasis to an outsider perspective or an objective evaluation. Deontological interpretations of the public interest. Deontological views of morality focus not on substantive outcomes, but on rights, fairness of approach, and justice. The two approaches associated with deontological interpretations are rights-based approaches and dialogical approaches. Rights-based approaches is premised on the assumption that this is the best means of achieving consistent, universal, and impartial decisions, and therefore of protecting individual rights. This is a central plank for liberal thinking. Dialogical approaches focuses on deliberation as a means of arriving at a consensus and agreement. The emphasis is on procedural norms and rules. This is commonly associated with participatory forms of democracy. In conclusion, although the idea of public interest is often scorned by contemporary planning theorists, this article has argued that it remains the pivot around which debates about the nature of planning and its purposes turn. This chapter argues that the best way that public interest is discovered is through participatory practices, although, as we have seen, there are many different ways in which people choose to participate in the process of serving their own public interests.